Welcome to the Yoga of Radiant Presence retreat. A few things initially, just about the retreat in general. Please be comfortable, be loose, be easy. There's no rules or no regulations or nothing you have to do. So please relax and enjoy yourself. Obviously it's very hot, so emphasize on the take it easy, stay cool. In general, if I'm out in a public area, I'm available to talk if anyone wants to talk about things more individually than here when we get together. If I'm not in a public area, then I'm not available. So that's about it. This retreat is about the yoga of radiant presence. What is radiant presence? The purpose of the yoga of radiant presence is to discover directly and self-verifyingly the answer to that question. Everyone knows radiant presence. It's impossible to know anything else whatsoever. This is radiant presence. Radiant presence is absolute normalcy. And yet, radiant presence is inconceivably transcendental and sacred. Radiant presence is very strange, which is why spirituality is not as self-evident as one might expect. If this is radiant presence, and everyone knows radiant presence, then why bother? Well, in a profound sense, that's a very good question. Why bother? Who gives a shit? This is it. However, there are some of us who answer that question by saying, I really want to get to the bottom of this. I really want to know and understand this as intimately as possible. And for those of us who I assume might include you all, since you're bothered to be here, then this yoga addresses that issue. There is nothing here but radiant presence. There is no building here. There are no people here. There are no chairs here. There's no personality here. There's no mind here. None of these things are actually here. It looks like they're here. And of course, we're all very familiar with that. But this apparition of all of this inconceivable detail of things, of conditions, of specific entities is not what you're used to taking it as. And coming to see the way in which that's so is the process of yoga. And definitively self-verifying to see the way that that's so is realization or liberation or whatever you want to call it. Of course, what you call it is not particularly important. Radiant presence is not radiant presence. That's just a phrase I made up to try to convey the essence of it in a succinct fashion. All sorts of religious traditions have all sorts of sophisticated terminology that they have created to address these things, most of which have all sorts of, seeming to me, very misleading implication and confusing innuendo. In Buddhism, it's called, radiant presence is called the three bodies of Buddha. In Advaita, it's called the Atman. I don't know what they call it in Christianity, probably the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. In Kashmir Shaivism, it's Shiva Shakti, or the Tattvas. And all of that implies, for people that have studied all of these religious traditions, or any of these religious traditions, there's an incredible backlog of innuendo and boilerplate and philosophy, splitting hairs about this, that, and the other details of these supposed different principles, none of which are necessarily particularly clarifying or particularly cut to the quick of exactly what this is, so that one can see it. It's actually very, very, very simple. Its very simplicity is part of why it's so difficult to recognize, because we're so caught up in our complexity. We're so caught up in our complex narratives and our complex analyses of what we are and what's happening, that the absolute stark simplicity of this that is here as it is seems too good to be true. It seems too simple. It couldn't be that. So what is it? It's radiant presence. Well, what is presence? Presence is completely obvious, right? Presence. My hand is present, right? You're present. The light is present. The air conditioning is present. The sound is present. And most people would stop there. But if you look at it more closely, you'll discover that presence does not inhere in objects. Objects inhere in presence. If you look at your experience, you'll find your experience is a continuum of presence. And there's all of these various objects appearing, or experiential conditions appearing, that are all present as they appear. But the presence doesn't gain when more objects appear, and the presence doesn't diminish when fewer objects appear. The presence is an absolute constant presence. You could just call it being, but that sounds very abstract. Being, it's like, okay, being. But it's much more intimate than that. It's much more first person. This is the presence of your experience. Just this that is right here, this presence. I mean, it's completely obvious. It's not even subtle. This presence, right? Presence? Anyone here not in the loop? Anyone here is like, presence? What presence? I've never seen any presence. I mean, right? Presence? So this presence, this obvious presence, this presence is the absolute principle. And it does not inhere in the things that seem to be present, as I said. It is that within which all phenomena seemingly occur. So presence is a very, very powerful key to the practical aspects of this yoga. Because presence is completely obvious, completely accessible. Check out presence, tune into presence. Notice presence. And right away, you will experience a profound shift in orientation. You may not recognize it as profound, but that's not important. Just experiencing presence rather than what is present, which is the normal human mode. What's going on? Who's here? What's happening? Where's it at? What's the buzz? What have you been doing? All that is all what's been appearing, all the apparitions. that humans are used to focusing on. All of which is fine, and we'll get to that. It's not a matter of like, oh, that's evil or wrong, but it's just that it's remedial attention. Typically, we're so used to attending to the characteristics and the qualities and the apparent things that are present, and we just take for granted, well, of course they're present. There's just presence. Of course, it's presence. Yeah. Whereas, in actual fact, it's the other way around. The presence is where the action is. The presence is what is powerful. The presence is what is revelatory and transforming. So this is a very powerful, a very primal key to this yoga. Now, thank you. Now, an interesting thing about this presence is it never shows up naked. It never shows up plain vanilla. It always shows up as some apparent qualities that are present. Now, these qualities may be unqualifiable. They may not be qualities you have language for. They may be subtle vibes or moods or just the various sketchiest wisps of whatever. But it never shows up naked. It never shows up the stripped down, absolute empty presence. It always shows up with, it projects or is a medium for what we might call experiential qualities. And this is what I call radiance. The presence is always a medium of infinite elaboration, infinite qualitative expression. But there's no polarity here. It's not like there's presence here and there's apparition there. If you look at the apparition, you're seeing presence. If you look at presence, you'll see apparition, because they never show up individually or separately as autonomous things. So calling it radiant presence is in a sense, another way misleading. But this is inevitable because the structure of language is so ass backwards and sloppy, and it conforms to the actual structure of reality so poorly that the most articulate way of putting anything is going to be completely wrong. So, so who gives a shit? Just have at it. So this is radiant presence. That's the whole shooting match right there. But it's subtle, it's strange. It's very, very, very slippery. This, as we all know, if you look at your experience, and you've been doing this for a good long time, all of us, you're aware of how strange and slippery and fractal and holographic and undefinable and ungraspable all of these characteristics are. It's like all these characteristics are like mirages. They appear completely obviously, but you try and pin down exactly what they are or how they are, and it eludes you. It disappears just when you have your fingers on its throat, And so, a primary quality of radiant presence is unresolvability. It cannot be found. It's completely obvious, but you can't pin it down. You can't get to the bottom of it. You can't say what it is. You can't, get to the bottom line and say, okay, now I know it. And so this unresolvability is part and parcel of radiant presence. So in a very profound sense, if you look very intelligently and skillfully for radiant presence and you don't find anything, you found radiant presence. Which sounds very paradoxical, but is absolutely true. So, part of the strangeness and part of the slipperiness of this yoga is that there is no end to it. There is no finish line in a naive, simple sense that a newbie might expect. You know, oh, let's see. Well, I'll do the yoga and I'll find it, and then I'll have it, and then okay, great. You know, then it's Miller time. But in actuality, it's not like that. It's more like jumping off a cliff into infinite, endless weirdness that just falls into infinite, endless weirdness. That falls into infinite, endless weirdness, and that's it. That is the result. That is the end. The end is endlessness. The result is resultlessness. And so, coming to see, developing the subtlety and the acumen and the intelligence to come to see for yourself exactly the way that that's so, in contrast with our ingrained and brainwashed and egoic desire to, to own it, to solve it, to get to the end of it, the normal human mode of check it off a list and go on to the next thing kind of, is just not appropriate. It doesn't actually work like that. And to be successful in this yoga, one has to develop this kind of subtlety to be able to perceive this. In contradistinction to one's personality urges and one's personality inclinations, which will persist. In practice, it's always a very strange property of this yoga that as one practices this yoga, as one develops more and more subtlety, more and more skillfulness, more and more penetrating insight and vision, one's normal dogged neurotic personality doesn't go away. It's not solved. So in a way, it's a very schizophrenic kind of a condition where one's individuality persists contrary to, seemingly, and in the face of this astounding transcendental condition that is seen more and more to be comprehensively everything. And this also flies in the face of a lot of simplistic spirituality, where spirituality is seen to be the antidote to the personality, the antidote to the self, to remove all flaws and purify all obscurations and all of these sorts of things. So I'm going to turn myself into a Boy Scout or something, that's going to, and then somehow that's going to be the important thing. But it's not actually like that. And again, this is to a degree, or maybe to a large degree, contrary to expectation and contrary to the ingrained inclinations of our personalities, where we want to embody things, we want to own things, we want to be powerful, we want to be successful, we want to be whatever, and it's not actually like that. Over dinner, we were having a conversation about a system of rating people's realization or something. Where, I don't know what's his name. What's the guy's name? Hawking or something? Hawkins. Anyway, he rates people's realization on a scale of, I suppose, 0 to 1,000. Although Trump apparently has several hundred, so I guess there's no 0. but this misses the point, because radiant presence is always 1,000, and everything is radiant presence. So this is 1,000. So wherever you are, and however much of a clod you are, it's just that you're really 1,000. And if you come to see this, you get the 1,000 without needing to not stop being a clod, because it's not about that. On the contrary, if you have the inclinations to work for self-improvement, you're free to, and that's fine. No harm, no foul. It doesn't matter what you do or don't do. It's not about that. It's about coming to see what is intrinsically the case, regardless of your actions or your non-actions. And so again, this is another subtle, perhaps seeming contradiction of naive expectations of the yoga versus the actuality. In practice, one comes to discover that the essence of the yoga is paradox. It's never this or that. Which again demands the development of a certain sophistication, subtlety of intelligence, a tolerance and appreciation of ambiguity, of paradox, of unresolvability, which again is somewhat alien in the human realm. Apparently, the people that originally founded this were a contactee cult. Sort of feels like that from this room, doesn't it? All elaborate interpretations, like contactees, or angelic visitations, or ascended masters, or any of this, fall short. They are based on the actuality of radiant presence, but they don't go far enough. They don't take it far enough. They don't see unresolvability. They resolve it into some thing, some principle, the angels or the aliens or the masters or the this or the that. Whereas radiant presence does not resolve. It does not come to a specific manifest figurehead. It is everything and anything is its figurehead. Absolute failure is its figurehead. The chaos and randomness of human existence is the pure transcendental sacramental expression of radiant presence. And again, this can be a little difficult to stomach because, who wouldn't want to have a nice, Santa Claus figure or Jesus or even God to sort of, thank I found it, it's there. And yet, radiant presence is even better because it's actual and it's right here. You already have it. I mean, what could be cooler than that? So, over the next several days, we'll be looking at this from many, many different angles. There's infinite ramifications. And in particular, the most important thing about this yoga is it is not an objective philosophy or principle to try to adopt yourself to. It is looking at the reality of your own experience and seeing the way it is this and grappling with the ways it seems to not be this. And that's always your knife edge. That's the cutting edge of the yoga of, when you see something that seems to be something, then that's an invitation to look closer until you see it isn't, because there's nothing here. There is actually, literally, nothing here. Not that any of this is negated. There's just none of this to negate. It looks as if there's all of this crazy shit happening, but it's not really like that. There's actually, literally, physically, metaphysically, nothing here whatsoever. And so anytime anything looks like something, seems to have an anchor of thingness to it, or of importance to it, then that is right there, your target, to take your yoga gun out. The mechanism of delusion, the reason for needing yoga in the first place, is interpretation. Basically, it's a narrative that exists in one's imagination, telling yourself a story of what's happening, what things are. Now, this narrative in itself is not particularly powerful and not particularly problematic. In fact, it's largely amusing. We do this all the time. The mind's continually talking to itself, saying this and saying that and spouting bullshit or having insight or whatever. And that's sort of an ongoingly the case. I forgot what I started saying. That's embarrassing.
About delusion.
Oh, yes, thank you very much. Delusion. So this narrative, this interpretive framework that the mind continually, spontaneously spins out without cessation ever, is the basis of the problem. But that's not really the problem. The problem is not interpretive frameworks. The problem is not these narrations. The problem is belief in the narrations. And belief is insidious because it happens unconsciously. We don't do it on purpose. And when we're doing it, we don't even know we're doing it. Belief settles like a concrete anchor. And things seem to be a certain way. And you have a knowing that they are that way. And someone comes to you and suggests that maybe they're not that way, and you sort of laugh either internally or externally because you know they're full of shit because it is like that way. And this is a symptom of belief. Now, beliefs are challenging to chip away at because they're not amenable to logic. They're not amenable to argument. Most people, if I said there's nothing here, they would go, "Oh, right, yeah, sure, nothing here." But there's literally nothing here. I know there's nothing here. And it's actually not that hard to know there's nothing here. But you have to see the way that that's so, self-verifyingly, and then you know that there's nothing here. But typically, for most people, I suppose, they know there is something here. And they know what it is, and they know what's good about it or bad about it, and they know what's important about it, and they know what they think about it, and they know what ought to be done about it, and there's this whole incredible backlog or deluge of implication and narrative and whole worldviews about everything. It's like a political view, If you're a liberal, you know everything about everything, you know how it ought to be and why isn't it that way. And if you're a conservative, same thing. And if you're a nutcase contactee, same thing. And if you're anything, same thing. And all of that is nothing other than belief. And belief is in interpretive frameworks which are fictions. There's no such thing as a true interpretation. There's no such thing as an accurate interpretation because radiant presence is unresolvable. It cannot be interpreted. It cannot be, you can't say what anything is. And yet, the whole bread and butter, the whole nuts and bolts of interpretation is saying what things are. And then belief, that sinks down to belief, and then that becomes knowing what things are. And then you're lost, as we say in the trade. I mean, not literally, of course, because none of this is actually anything. None of this is even here. It's rather like a bad dream. has no importance whatsoever because it's just a dream, so who gives a shit? So a lifetime of delusion and suffering is nothing. And seeing through it is nothing. But for those that have the perverse inclination to want to see through it, it is possible. And this is where yoga comes in. Does anyone know where the thermostat is? Maybe we can raise it up a few degrees. Pam, do you know where the thermostat is?
There's something wrong there.
No, it's over there. I don't know how to run it though. Oh, thank you, Greg. Well, I'll talk for a while.
I suppose that we could move a little closer.
Yeah, by all means. Come close, pick up a chair and come close because it's very echoing here and I know my voice isn't what it once was.
Yeah, mine.
But your hearing and my speaking. Fortunately, it doesn't matter. So, these belief systems are impossible to work on because they're not amenable to argument. They're not amenable to anything because they know. And anything you show them, you're wrong, unless it reinforces the belief. And even if it is wrong, it will reinforce the belief because the belief will claim it and have its way with it. So, it's useless in yoga to approach this investigation in terms of trying to address or correct or fix the beliefs, which at root are the problem. However, fortunately, you don't need to. You don't need to fix beliefs. It's much simpler than that. You explore your experience until you come to see the way that it actually is. And the way that it actually, as you accumulate a backlog of noticing how this actually is, noticing what radiant presence is actually like, your beliefs will spontaneously lighten, they will spontaneously dissipate in terms of the urgency or the importance with which you hold them. Because what you discover when you look at what your experience actually consists of entirely contradicts what the beliefs hold to be true, entirely contradicts the content of the beliefs. So you basically render the beliefs irrelevant without ever addressing the beliefs. So the most practical way to approach yoga is entirely positively. You don't try to remedy anything. You don't try and solve anything. You don't try and chip away at anything that's problematic. On the contrary, just go to the, accentuate the positive. Go to the radiance itself and let it show you what it is. And it's fairly easy to learn to see this. And as you come to see this, you will. It will. It's like an old-fashioned equal arm scales. Right now the beliefs are down here and radiance is somewhere up here, if anywhere. And basically, as you accumulate more and more experience of the nature of radiance and the nature of what your experience actually is, they go like this, and eventually it hits the point where it goes, whoop, and then the radiance has the center of gravity, and your beliefs are irrelevant. They may or may not stop. You may still be a liberal asshole or whatever, but you won't give a shit because that'll just be an echo. They have this wonderful image that I've heard in Eastern spiritual philosophy of the burnt rope. You have a rope, you burn it, it still looks like the same rope, but it won't bear any weight. And that's a wonderful image for qualities of personality and orientations and beliefs and all the things that we as an individual are made of in the face of radiant presence. It doesn't necessarily disappear, it doesn't go away, but it ceases its relevance. It becomes completely unimportant. Because in actuality it is unimportant, and as you become more and more familiar with what is actually here, with what you actually are, and the way it is that, then that overwhelmingly outweighs and invalidates any relevance all of this silly individuality may seem to have. So the practice of yoga is entirely, the efficient practice of yoga is entirely about looking at the nature of radiant presence, which is, in simple terms, means looking at your experience. Look at your experience. How does your experience work? Your experience does not work the way you're used to thinking of it as working. And it's very easy to notice that. And over the course of the next few days, we'll be looking at this and various techniques and aspects of this in great depth. But superficially, or initially, I can say, for example, only the present moment exists. It's completely obvious experientially. This. It's always this. It's never that. It's always now. It's never then. There's no past. Past is a fantasy you have now. Future is a fantasy you have now. History is a fantasy you have now. So this is completely obvious. Everyone knows this. Every 1-year-old knows that there's only the present moment. You know, we get beaten and brainwashed into all of this elaboration and history and cause and effect and all of this stuff, which doesn't actually exist. And then we buy it. You know, it sinks into our belief system, and then we're stuck in it. We're stuck in time. I'm stuck in history. I'm a creature of, the evolution of humanity out of the Glades into this hellish, self-destructing civilization we live in. But all of that is an entire fantasy, and it's just not true. Because this now is all there is. And this is very easy to see. So this is an excellent contact point for yoga. Again, presence which is essentially the same thing. All of these supposed aspects of radiant presence converge because there are no separate aspects to radiant presence. It has its nature. It is what it is, and these aspects are like myths of it, but they are poignant myths because they converge into it. So looking at now is all that there is. You can't not find anything other than now. Here is all that there is. You cannot find anywhere other than here. Where's New York right now? It's a thought. There's no New York. Where's the lunchroom right now? It doesn't exist. It's a thought. Oh no, it's not. It's over there. I know it is. And that's belief talking. But the evidence of experience does not support that. The evidence of experience is, if you're not experiencing it, it doesn't exist. And we're very familiar with this from dreams. We accord the waking state a privileged condition where the waking state is real, the waking state has duration, the waking state has history. In dreams, things come and go and they bootstrap themselves up out of nothing and they generate their own backstory in real time. And all of this is completely obvious, at least when you wake up or go lucid. When you're lost in the dream, of course, and here we are in the waking state lost in a dream. And yet, if you look at the evidence experientially, it's exactly the same. The backstories come now. There's no backstory over there that's accumulating to now. The backstories all are generated now. The future anticipations are generated now. Other locations are generated now. So all of this stuff is generated now, here. And of course, and experientially, all you can find is now and here, right? I mean, duh. Now, even though that's self-evident, the potency of that and the implication of that is easily lost on someone who has not had that pointed out to them. Because, of course, there's You know, there's here and there's now, but there's all this other stuff that's out there. You know, I know it's there, it's waiting. If I went to New York, it would be there. You know, and blah blah. Okay, great. You know, that sounds wonderful, but it's actually not like that. But to come to see the way that it's not like that, you have to see for yourself. Otherwise, it just sounds like another wacko theory. So this stuff is absolutely useless as philosophy. It only becomes powerful and becomes vital when it is seen for yourself. So yoga is always an individual activity. It's a first-person activity. It's an activity that you do, or not. And yet, strangely, all experience is yoga. The nice thing about the yoga of radiant presence is you can't not do it. You've always been doing it. The self-engagement of consciousness with experience that constitutes your experience and that has always been your experience is the mechanism of the yoga of radiant presence, and is, in fact, radiant presence dancing with itself, which is the mechanism of yoga of radiant presence. And since that is the case, it's possible to see that that's the case and discover that's the case, at which time that invalidates anything contrary to that being the case, and that will be clearly seen to be based on fantasy and interpretation, whereas this is not a fantasy. This presence here is not a thought, it's not a fantasy, it's undeniable, it is self-verifying. This radiance, all of these apparent characteristics, they're not a fantasy, they're not a theory or a philosophy, it's a self-verifying actuality. Radiant presence is actual, and actuality is what is powerful. Actuality alone is powerful. And radiant presence alone is actual. So, cool. It all comes together. So, it's really just a kind of a reality check of exploring more subtly and more precisely exactly what is actual, and which will invalidate what you're used to thinking of as being actual, but doesn't stand up to scrutiny. It doesn't stand up to experiential observation. And there's many other aspects to this that we will be going into at great length. I feel like it's a pretty comprehensive overview. Does anyone have any questions? Not particular questions about issues with your experience or that, but just general questions about what I've been talking about, in broad strokes.
If it's inconclusive, how can you know?
You can know that it's inconclusive.
How can you know that?
It's inconclusive that it's inconclusive, and you can know that. If it's inconclusive that it's inconclusive, then it's absolutely inconclusive. That may sound like sophistry, but but dude, look at it. That's some strong shit. It gets to a point where conclusive or inconclusive becomes games that we play with ourselves. This is this, and it is as it is, and you can't say anything about it, you can't ask any questions about it. And so, but is it conclusive or not? You know, it's like, that becomes really sort of absurd, an absurd question and an absurd distinction in the face of the direct experience. Perhaps at a certain point, but you know, certainly ultimately. You know, any and all, since this is unresolvable, any and all questions about it and drawing distinctions about it melt away, because there's no basis for drawing a distinction. You know, much of what I've said tonight is utter bullshit. much of what I've said tonight is not accurate at all, but it's suggestive and it's potentially useful as a way of sort of jumping into the strangeness of this kind of an exploration. You know, no distinctions can be made. You can't think about this. There's no accurate thought you can have about this. But again, you don't need to, because here it is. You know? So in a certain sense, the most accurate thinking you can do is spacing out, you know. For real. And yet, thought doesn't contradict that, because thought itself isn't really thought. Thought itself is just really sloppy spacing out, which again is discovered in the course of the yoga. So the yoga is, you know, the nature of radiant presence. The course of the yoga is actually not contrary to anything. It effortlessly includes everything. So it has no enemies. It has nothing that needs to be solved or corrected or avoided, or no downsides. It's like a black hole. It effortlessly, although it's even more profound than a black hole, because a priori it already has sucked in everything, because there never was anything that was unsucked, so to speak. So in the course of the yoga, as one gets to a certain point, one loosens up and lightens up and gets much more interested in open-ended textures than in drawing distinctions of this or that. And it becomes much more of a sort of a hedonistic, delicious, ongoing imbibing than a question of analysis or drawing distinctions or trying to pin something down, or wait a minute, is it this or that? Is this, am I doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? It becomes just much more a kind of opening into ever-present lusciousness, which, you know, of course, has always been the case. And everyone knows that it's the case, you know, but we're usually too caught up in our bullshit to devote any much time to it for most people. You know, most people are caught up in their ambitions and their investments and what they think is important and social stuff and blah, blah, blah. But everyone knows the feeling of, everyone knows that, you know. I mean, it would be a very, very sad person that didn't have some inkling of that, that lusciousness. And that lusciousness is the essence of radiant presence. So another aspect of the yoga is, at a certain point very early on, or maybe not very early on, depending on the individuality, it becomes seductive. It becomes so much fun and so joyful. It just, you know, the idea of having anything else having any importance, or anything else, you know, wanting to do anything else becomes absurd, because why on earth would I want to do that?
Is texture the same as quality?
Sure, absolutely.
So what would the quality of radiant presence be?
Well, it can't be said.
It can't be said.
It can't be said. It's infinite,
So how would we know?
infinite.
How would we know that we're experiencing radiant presence?
Well, you know it by coming to see that that is the case. You know it by its self-verifying quality. Let me ask you, like, you know that you're experiencing experience right now, right? So that's self-verifying, right? So likewise, so you start with that. So here's experience. It is certain. There's no doubt. It's not an argument. It's not, my experience or not. Let me think about it. You know, it's not like that. That's laughable. It's like, it's self-verifying actuality. So you start with any self-verifying actuality and feel what that is. Simply that. And you don't need to say, well, how to feel it, which kind of feel, you know, what direction to feel. Anyway, it doesn't matter. You know, it's wonderful, actually. It's a lovely yoga to practice, because it doesn't matter how you do it. It doesn't matter what you do. You just start from any actuality and let it open to itself. And the very nature of actuality is it always spontaneously opens to itself. Experience continually drifts into open, continually. You know, we think of this perhaps as being the passage of time. You know, whatever you're experiencing now, a little while ago you're experiencing something else. Well, how did that become this? It just sort of drifts into this. It's continually morphing. Newness is continually manifesting, and oldness is continually, melting away.
So it's not doubting that you're having that experience.
Well, even if
what you were saying earlier,
even if you doubt it, even if you doubt it, then doubt is present, and there's no doubt that that's present. So it's not a matter of doubting it or not. It's a matter of the fact that it is undeniable. It's beyond the category of being doubtable or not undoubtable. You can doubt it all you want. You can say, "Gosh, let me doubt that I'm experiencing anything," but that's the very fact that you're saying it means you're experiencing something. So it's kind of a settling into a reality check. It's a settling into what's actual, what is undeniably here, and don't worry too much about what it is. Just find some undeniable here-ness and feel what that's like. That's a good way to put it.
And you say it will show you.
Yes, it will show you. It always has been showing you. All your life it's been showing you. Everything you've learned, all the insight you've had, any wisdom you've experienced, where did they come from? It grows out of the presence of actuality.
One more question.
But let me add to that just briefly. And the nature of the yoga is when you begin to attend to the yoga more deliberately, that opening increases in efficiency enormously. So, and normal experience is yoga, but a deliberate and intentional practice of yoga ramps that up all of a sudden, and it's like getting a shot of steroids or something. It just it takes off.
So I may be getting a little ahead of myself, but can you communicate with that presence, you directly with it?
Of course, you always are, but there's no you to communicate. The presence communicates with itself.
Okay, good.
And the you that is you is seen to be just presence. Without being negated. It's not like you have to be erased or zapped into non-existence. You already are non-existent, but you come to see the way that that's so, and looking at the texture of actuality is what shows you the way that that's so. And it's non-verbal, it's not analytical, it's not by figuring something out or being able to describe it. It's just a feeling, but it's an intelligent feeling. I haven't talked about this explicitly so far tonight. A very important aspect of radiant presence is it is hyper intelligent. It itself is inconceivable intelligence. So and your intelligence, any intelligence that you're used to identifying with or claiming that, well, I'm not a pretty smart guy. I'm not a total idiot. Whatever. Any intelligence that you're used to sort of, I'm kind of smart. Sure. That is the most pale, paltry, pathetic reflection of the intelligence that radiant presence has, which is your intelligence, and you already have it. So a large part of the way this yoga works is by letting yourself feel into radiant presence. You've discovered the intelligence, you discover the inherent intelligence, you discover the intelligence of the radiant presence. And as you discover it, you get to avail yourself of it. It's not an analytical intelligence. It's not an intelligence that relies upon process. It's an intelligence that is inconceivable transcendental integration. And it's already here. You already are it and have it. It's what's doing you. It's what all this inconceivable detail and intricate function. Look at this body. I mean, Jesus Christ. I mean, talk about functional intricacy. That intelligence does that in real time, just spontaneously. It's like poof. You know, here's the world and all of its, and every leaf waving in the breeze, and every, you know, the feeler on every ant, and every molecule, and every atom dancing, you know, quantum mechanically in perfect synchronicity with every other quark in the universe. And it does this just riffing in real time. It's just like, poof, here it is. Okay. I mean, that is some powerful shit. That is inconceivable potency. You know, again, I'm not talking mythologically or philosophically. It's actually this. This is actually that. And what is doing all of that is radiant presence. And so that inconceivable hyper-functional intelligence is what this already is. And since you are this, it's what you already are. So a big part of what makes the yoga work is as you begin to plug into radiant presence, all of a sudden you gain access, so to speak. You notice, you let yourself settle in the inherent intelligence, and you hit what's called siddhis, where the inherent intelligence, the hyper functionality and miraculous functionality and insight of the inherent intelligence becomes explicitly available, and that becomes the basis for profound insight and revelation, and ultimately becomes the basis of realization, of a manifest realization. You know, in a certain sense, realization is a myth because everything's already realized. This is already radiant presence. It's realized. So when you see when you say you have a realized yogi or a yogi who is an advanced yogi, they are manifesting that realization, that a priori realization, to whatever degree karmically that they are able. But it's not like they're realized. It's that they are manifesting the realization that is inherent. They're manifesting the inherent intelligence. And you know, this is in the nature of miraculousness. But everything's in the nature of miraculousness. All these colors appearing. I mean, it's a miracle. Poof. All of this stuff here, right now, bang. I mean, it's a fucking miracle. It's like bang. You know, just no precedent. Even modern science, even if they evoke precedent, you know, it's like, well, everything that's here is here because of previous epochs of, you know, the development of elements within their galaxies, and the galaxies were formed out of the primordial, you know, hyperinflated bullshit, blah, blah, blah. And it all goes back to what? And then at the beginning, there was a big bang. It's like, wait a minute, guys, you dropped the ball here. What exactly does that mean? That means a fucking miracle. All right? Since it comes from a miracle, what's the point of sort of recessing that 30 billion years or whatever? Why not just, if that was a miracle, then this is a miracle. You know, and that's a fantasy anyway, because if there was a Big Bang, this is what it looks like right now. And since you can only find now, check out the Big Bang right here, right now. And here's your miracle. You don't need to defer it. You don't need to structuralize it, make it historical. Well, once there was a miracle, and now we're just, you know, pathetically wading through this detritus of that miracle. It's like, really?
I'm curious, Peter, when you come to the place of languaging your experience, do you feel a sense of getting funneled in, like when you're totally alone and quiet? Is your experience even more profound than what you're able to speak of with your language?
No, it's the same amount of profundity. It's really just a matter of, it's sort of an arbitrary drifting of attention. When I do talks like this, or when I'm working with people, the attention is on that aspect of the radiance. If I'm just hanging out, then it's wherever it is. I may be, you know, spacing out in profundity, or I may be wondering what's on TV tonight. but ultimately, there's no difference, because it's all the profundity of radiance. And there's, you know, one of the most profound signposts of realization is one stops drawing distinctions. Not that one stops having preferences, but one stops drawing distinctions because it's all just flavors of radiance. It really is. And this becomes known, again, self-verifyingly and with complete full obviousness.
Thank you.
But, you know, focus of attention, we'll be talking about this over the next couple of days. Focus of attention is a fascinating phenomenon because the part of the nature of the radiance is it spontaneously generates this ongoing sort of focus. And it always does so purposefully, whatever its purpose is, if any. I mean, that's more bullshit, but I'll say it anyway. It always does so purposefully, but most of the time it's not acknowledged as being relevant, because most of the time it's like, well, I'm driving on the road and I glance over there and I see that particular piece of garbage on the side. Why did my attention go to that? Why? You know, what's the cosmic purpose of that? Well, you can't answer that question. Is there anything? You can't answer that question. Why? But everything is basically all the explicit aspects of your experience is the radiance dancing with itself. And this process of it dancing with itself is its intrinsic process. It never stops dancing with itself. So everything that you are is this dance. The process of your insipid delusion as a clueless whatever is that dance. And your coming to insight and maturing is that dance. And when you attain realization, it's that dance. And it's always been that. And the process is continuous. The process is ongoing. Or rather than saying continuous, I would say exclusive. And so every seeming aspect of actuality is that process. So this seeming phenomena of the spontaneous generation of foci, there's a word to conjure with, foci of attention, focuses of attention, is another aspect of that. But in yoga, this becomes very useful because to some degree, one can participate with this focus, which we're all kind of familiar with. And the way in which that happens is very strange, because if you look at it very closely, you can't say you're doing it, but at the same time, there's a certain participatory sense in there. And of course, because it's all ultimately unresolvable, that never actually falls out as being one way or another. But a good point in practical terms is don't use your theories to limit yourself. Use your theories to augment your function. So rather than saying I don't have any free will, everything is just taken care of, that sort of leaves you what? Why not say I'm omnipotent, I can do whatever I want, and then at least you can be doing whatever you want, whether or not you're actually doing it, but you're sort of empowering yourself with your delusion rather than limiting yourself with your delusion. So anyway, so focus of attention is one way in which one can participatory surf the radiance. One can, look at different dimensions. The radiance is infinite dimensional. By dimensions, I mean, let's say, seemingly contiguous realms of texture. So there's an infinity of these, sort of thought bubbles of texture that each have whatever identity they have because of their self-similarity and their seeming textural difference with other dimensions. And not that any of that is actually that, but it kind of seems as if it might be. So it's not. So it's valid to look at it that way. So there's all of these dimensions of texture, and one can more or less deliberately focus one's attention in different dimensions, which can be very elucidating, particularly in terms of our habit of living a dull and structured life of, well, I'm here and I'm in my body and I'm in this world and I'm, as opposed to I'm a an infinite space of infinite dimensions, all of which are, infinitely different than each other, and all of which manifest different properties and different potencies, and you can seemingly deliberately, more or less participate in these, and explore them, and enjoy the apparent potencies that they have, and so on and so forth. All of which is part and parcel of the yoga, of exploring the dimensions that experience actually consists of. Experience is infinitely rich, and we typically dumb it down by our conceptions of what it is. We might think, well, there's the five senses, and then there's the sense of the mind, and then there's maybe whatever else you want to add to that. But that is pathetically paltry. There's infinite dimensions, and dimensions above that, and dimensions are. It's just endless difference, and endless range of qualitative phenomena that are all experientially present right now. It's just a matter of letting yourself notice it, letting yourself trip on it. Those of you that have experience with, in-depth meditation, or dare I say it, illicit drug use, may have some experience of this astounding range of different textures that spontaneously manifest within this field. And so by deliberately or quasi-deliberately surfing your focus of attention to push the envelope of going to different dimensions of texture, this can be a very liberating experience in itself, just in terms of getting yourself out of a limited, small worldview of what you are and what your experience is.
Do you feel that all the dimensions are the expression or the articulation of just one dimension? Like there's like infinite levels, but they're all the expression of the one radiant presence.
Yes, except radiant presence isn't one. So that sets up a kind of a false dichotomy, and it's not like that. Radiant presence includes itself, but it's radiant presence is infinite. So it's an infinite inclusivity. But you can't say it's one, you can't say it's not one. Because again, that would be qualifying, and it's absolutely unqualifiable. That's a philosophical argument, but in actuality, that's the case. It cannot be qualified. You can't say it's one, you can't say it's many.
You can't say it's one because there's no limits to it.
Yeah.
The limits there have to be limits for it to be one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. It is beyond limit.
Okay.
In any sense.
The idea that the placement of attention is liberating, I've had experience with that, and I've experimented a lot in placing my attention on various things to bust out of the prison of the usual way of looking at things.
Sure.
But ultimately, I found that it kind of boomerangs. No matter where I place my attention, it boomerangs back to underscoring of the identity as well. Can you comment on that at all?
The identity, such as it is ever present. It's not a matter, you're not trying to get out of the identity or solve the identity. What you're really doing is exploring the infinite reaches of the identity, most of which don't look particularly identity-ish. So you can find some experiential realms that just don't have much to do with identity or not, one way or the other. Just experiential textures that are, is this me? Is it not me? Is it, it's like that. It just doesn't stand up.
Well, I came to the point of feeling that it was more liberating to place less attention in a way than when I was heavy-handedly placing attention.
No, absolutely.
To try to do something that it did something, but it also it ended up reinforcing this sense of separate I-ness.
Absolutely. And this is an important point in developing skillfulness in yoga, because initially one may be heavy-handedly doing things. And as one matures as a yogi, one relaxes, one opens, one settles into spontaneity, which is less about doing. It doesn't necessarily negate doing or cancel it out, but that's not the feeling tone of it. And then there's a kind of a subtlety, there's a kind of a letting go, and then that letting go opens to a whole nother level of the same exploration. In a way, it's settling into the more transcendental doership of the inherent intelligence. Because the inherent intelligence is doing the individual egoic doership, but it's also doing the transcendental doership. You know, when I sit around and think, gosh, you know, I'm a pretty cool guy. You know? I mean, the inherent intelligence is doing that, and you know, when there's this astounding beauty of a sunset, the inherent intelligence is doing that. So it's the same doer, actually, but it's sort of framed or the feeling tone of it can seem to be a little different depending on one's obsessive orientation. So again, when one acquires more dimension of the kind of textures that one can arrive at through this more kind of a letting go, opening mode, then it's a whole nother, you know, a whole nother range of opening. It's really, yoga is really endless opening. And what that looks like, and technically what that looks like in terms of participation, is just an ongoing morphing of whatever it seems to be in your current phase. And it's never actually what it seems to be. But a cardinal overarching principle of radiant presence is nothing is ever what it seems to be. So anything that seems to be any particular way, your fantasy is supplying it. It's not actually like that.
It's interesting because that's what the radiance does, just what you described. That's the transcendental doer doing, fantasizing,
Absolutely.
interpretive frameworks, beliefs.
All of it. Yeah, the whole schmear. Yeah, so it's an in-house job. Radiant presence doesn't farm anything out.
It seems like the teachings are so often sort of set up or heard as, you know, I'm doing all the kind of as the beginning of the talk, you know, there's a belief that this is sort of functions at some level as the obstacle of sorts to seeing the unresolvability of everything, and that gets heard as the individual to do something about that, fix that, so that we get back to this transcendental. Meanwhile, that transcendental presence is exploding as all of that interpretation and all of that. And I don't know, it's funny because I think for so long I have been in that school of kind of in subtle ways, like sort of doing battle with interpretive frameworks. And it just feels like the path, if there's been a path, is one of just that just slowly seemingly eroding away to the point where the generation of interpretive frameworks is completely gone. I mean, like beyond time, just the miracle itself.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, absolutely. And this points out the seeming arc of yoga, which interestingly, the arc of yoga, what yoga looks like to the yogi is kind of like going up a mountain, cresting the top, and then coming down the mountain. So the initial phase of yoga, one is fighting to get out of one's normalcy and fighting to get transcendental, fighting to get more, fighting to open, fighting to find this, fighting to, it's always sort of vectoring out, outward bound, going beyond. Let me get out of here. I want to find the real shit. I want to find the good stuff. And then at a certain point, at the crest, you sort of don't really know what's going on. And And then gradually, the whole aspect of the flavor, of the tenor of your yoga will change, and you'll start. The yoga will become more incorporative. You'll start looking at what you were trying to get out of, and seeing that that is actually the same thing as you were finding, as you did get out of it. And so the first phase is sort of discriminatory and escapist, and the second phase is inclusive and incorporative and integrative. And one ends up where one started, curiously. The end result of yoga is absolute normalcy. But it's normalcy that you know what it is.
I'm not sure if it's another way of saying kind of like the territory you were referring to, but it seems to me that there's a freedom from knowing, or needing to know, or a freedom from not even figure anything out, and then it sort of gets this whole doing thing out of the way, so that you once referred to radiant presence as sort of like a relating to it as if it's a wild animal, you sort of treat it sort of obliquely. You don't look directly at it. It's sort of like, you get out of the way, you leave your house, and then the deer can come out of the forest and graze in your backyard, and it kind of comes. It really starts revealing itself as opposed to going out and grabbing for it. And but that's a freedom though, to not try to figure it out, because I think that that's the spiritual path up to has traditionally for me meant efforting and trying to figure it out.
And this is exactly the kind of transition I'm talking about, where superficially the sort of tenor of one's yoga will look like more of a struggling and more of a doing and more of a striving to whatever degree, and through all of which one is acquiring subtlety, one is developing nuance, and then as one crests and starts relaxing into things and opening into things and including things, there's a gentleness and an ease that comes with it. The metaphor of a wild animal is a very good one for yoga. I remember when we talked about that. That was a good one. Thanks for bringing that up. Doing yoga well, being with one's experience well, is like being with a wild animal. If you're at all heavy-handed, you're going to spook it. It's going to run off. So you learn to do it artfully, and learn to do it subtly, and then just sort of chill and relax. Don't be heavy-handed, and there's a kind of a flow and a kind of a gentle inclusiveness that can be noticed, that then becomes a mode of actual engagement rather than a way of demolishing the whole exchange. And developing subtlety in yoga is a lot like that. At first one sort of, well, what about you? You're sort of going like this, and the deer's just gone. Whereas one learns a gentleness and an ease and a kind of an artfulness of non-engaged engagement rather than a heavy-handed, focused, deliberate engagement that clears the whole thing. It ruins it. It blows it up. It demolishes it. And there's a grace and a gentleness to being with the texture of radiance. We're always with the texture of radiance, but the downside of the normal human mode is we're too heavy-handed about it, and as a result, it collapses into our crappy lives. Whereas if you're more gentle with it, if you're more artful with it, if you're more subtle with it, then it can reveal all these dimensions and all this nuance that reveals its nature, reveals its transcendental nature, which reveals the transcendental nature of yourself and of your crappy normalcy, which never was crappy normalcy. It was always miraculous transcendence. And one discovers this through coming to this artfulness, coming to this subtlety and sensitivity of yoga.
Would this be where you place Togal in the Dzogchen tradition, where you come to the peak of the mountain and realize that everything is radiant presence, and you've never been separate from it, and then you want to begin to incorporate the fullness of your life instead of trying to?
I wouldn't say literally in terms of Trekchö and Togel.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that at all. Trekchö and Togel, I think, are kind of artificially differentiated in the Nimas. I like the way the Bonpos, the older style Bonpos approach it much more, where they don't particularly differentiate them. They just talk about, you know, the yoga of Dzogchen, and all of this gradually comes on its own. I could criticize a lot of Tibetan yoga on that basis, is that, you know, they seem to have been voracious systematizers, you know, voraciously, you know, coming up with this, categorizing and systematizing it and assembly lining it, you know, kind of, you know, which is okay. I mean, there's nothing wrong with it, but I think it's inimical. It's antagonistic to the very nature, the flavor of radiant presence, which is not like that. The radiant presence is spontaneous. It flows. It opens. It's loose. It's easy, and yet it's overwhelmingly powerful. And so I find the most efficient yoga adopts the very flavor of the radiance itself, and that way, by aligning yourself with its spirit, with its flavor, with its dynamism, it opens, it integrates much more efficiently, much more rapidly. Whereas the problem with these various systematizations is you have to go through them to discover the way that they are true. Whereas if you don't even start with them, then it's irrelevant whether they're true or not. You know, Dzogchen is great perfection. This is great perfection. You know, you don't need systems. You know, and in terms of Dzogchen, this is a little specializing for those of you who are not Tibetan scholars. But in terms of Dzogchen, you know, the original Dzogchen tantras, the original teachings, were not systematized at all. They were very naked and very to the point. And then subsequently, over the centuries, there was development and commentary and elaboration and categorization and turning them into schools and so on and so forth. Whereas if you look at the original tantras, they're awesome, and there's no system there at all. They just say, this is it. You know, I mean, you know, poetically and artfully and evocatively.
Yeah.
And I personally, again, like I said, I feel that that's more consonant with the flavor of the radiant presence itself. So it's a more efficient way to go about it. It's in a way, there's nothing to overcome or unlearn, because you can learn all these systems, but then when you get to this, eventually you see the total irrelevance of that. Not that it's wrong or you need to negate it. Nothing needs to be negated, but it's unnecessary. You know, I'm an efficiency freak, so I like to hit it right the way that's going to be most efficient, maximal connection. And it makes sense to me, and in my experience, it's true that approaching it in the way that it is aligns you with it much more spontaneously and effortlessly than sort of approaching it and then overshooting and need to come back and I don't know what.
Thinking you can think your way into it.
Yeah, or anything, or you know, anything. Yeah. You know, it's simpler than that, and it's subtler than that, and all of this linearity that we humans are so used to doing is laughable in the face of this great condition.
Do you think all the trials and tribulations we go through with our thoughts of being a separate ego, that this is almost like a meditation of the radiant presence? That it's playing, like you mentioned, playing
absolutely,
with itself.
Absolutely. But again, the radiance seems to have, in terms of the individual experience on a human level, the radiance seems to have an arc where it seems to sort of approach itself very naively and then develop subtlety and sophistication as it goes along. You know, which we can observe in anyone's life in the gradual acquisition of wisdom and skillfulness to whatever degree that occurs. And what the yogi tries to do is maximize that and really, take it as far as it can go. But absolutely everything that is the radiance playing with itself on different levels, so to speak. And the yogi strives for it playing with itself on the most subtle levels that one can attain, the most comprehensive transcendental levels that one can attain, rather than the more naive, childlike levels of, sort of simplistic, egoic identification.
Did I hear you mention earlier that there's really no end to levels?
No end. And no levels. There's no end to levels and there are no levels.
It's actually built in 2011.
Now, please bear in mind, tonight's just an introductory talk. I'm just sort of laying out on the table the sort of the terrain that we're looking at here.
That's all that you're doing?
Yes, tonight that's all I'm doing. And during the course of the next several days, we'll be zooming in and out and approaching this from many different angles and many different aspects, always on a practical level, because remember, this is not a philosophy or a theory. This is something that you can use personally, and it only becomes powerful and potent for you to the degree that you engage in it experientially. It's not a, I mean, you can do that, you can collect it as a philosophy, but what a waste. It's like collecting atom bombs and never setting one off.
Really?
Don't you hate it when you see people doing that?
You have time for one more question?
Oh, absolutely.
You guys all right with this? I don't know if you're ready to go home.
There's no rush. We can wind down. I'm sorry. We can wind down over the next half hour, sooner or later. It doesn't matter however the momentum goes.
Okay. Can you talk a little about the concept of the dissolution of the ego?
Yes. That's an oversimplification. The ego does not ever dissolve because the ego was never solid to begin with.
The ego was never?
It was never solid to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And one comes to see this more and more clearly. And as one comes to see this, the ego recedes in importance, which can sort of poetically be called the dissolution of an ego, but nothing is actually dissolving because it was never there in the first place. The ego is a myth. It's not an entity. It's not integrated. Ego is a very sloppy summing up of all different sorts of energies and vortices of the transcendental energy. But as is everything. But there are no subsystems. There are no things. There are no entities. There's no ego. There's no body. Because there seems to be an ego. And there seems to be a body, and there is an actuality, which is what those names supposedly refer to. But that actuality is an actuality of transcendental energy dancing with itself, fractally, holographically, universally, and inclusively. So there's no separation. There's no thing here that's different from something here. The body is the totality of reality. The ego is the totality of reality. The world is the totality of reality. Any atom is the totality of reality. And so there are all of these subsystems, but they aren't actually systems and they aren't actually sub. They're sort of access points to the transcendental fullness of radiance. And during the course of yoga, one just comes to discover that, which is what liberates one from all of these subsystems. One becomes liberated from ego by seeing that the ego is never really the ego. It may or may not disappear, but it doesn't need to disappear because it was never really there. I mean, the person, your personality, you may have a flawed personality, you may have also, I don't know, you may be neurotic or whatever. I mean, we're all a mess, right? We're all scarred individuals, as our personalities. And that doesn't need to be fixed. It just needs to be seen. It doesn't actually exist as a system or as an entity or as a thing. It's actually an echo of the totality. It's an echo of reality itself. Every part, no matter how small, is the whole. And the way in which that's so is completely irrational to say that. I mean, it sounds like gibberish, and yet it's literally true. And during the course of yoga, one comes to see directly the way that that's so. And then, as I said, of course, you're liberated from that seeming being a problem. You're liberated from the ego being a problem because it's not really the ego, it's really everything, and so on and so forth. Nothing, over the course of yoga, nothing is necessarily changed, but everything is discovered to not be what you thought it was. And so you're freed from being stuck with what you thought it was, which is really what the problem is, because in reality, there's no problems. There's no problems. Isn't that good news? Actually, there are no problems. And there seems to be problems. They're defined into existence by inaccurate interpretation. So my ego is a problem, my personality is a problem, or my whatever is a problem. But the problematic aspect of that is defined into existence by an inaccurate, erroneous interpretation of what's actually happening, which is not like that at all. What's actually happening is radiant presence. And this is actually easy to discover, easy to see, and as one discovers it and sees it, then one becomes free of all these supposed problems because they were never problems at all. You know, I feel like that might be a nice place to let go for tonight. So tomorrow at tomorrow